Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Perry with the Circle of Atonement, and I'm here today with Holiday Phillips. I became aware of Holiday a few years ago when I was part of Danielle Laporte's Heart-Centered Leadership Program, although at the time it was called Heart-Centered Facilitator. And Holiday led the diversity and inclusion model on how to create safe spaces. And I was so impressed with you, Holiday, because here at the Circle, we are launching a study group initiative. And so I've been looking for teachers who can share how to create safe and inclusive spaces and also hold a principle of love. And after learning from you in Danielle's program, I started reading more of your work, fangirling you, basically. So it is just a real pleasure to be speaking with you today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here with you.
So for those who may be unfamiliar with Holiday and her work, Holiday is an organizational culture and leadership expert devoted to understanding and creating the conditions for bridging differences and moving from conflict to connection. She has spent 15 years working in leadership development, community building, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And she has worked for some of the world's largest organizations, including Google, Apple, LinkedIn, Visa, as well as many charities, public service, and community groups. Holiday is also the founder of the Center for Restorative Dialogue, a project that seeks to understand, curate, and promote conversations that heal polarization. And I think I want to start there because one of the reasons I'm so excited to talk to you today is because your work focuses on civil discourse, which is obviously something we don't have enough of in our world. And as I mentioned, I first became interested in your work because I was interested in learning how to create safe spaces, particularly for people of color, because the course community is disproportionately white, as you may know. But what I was getting was that safe spaces are created by looking at our internalized racism, watching out for microaggressions, not saying certain things, and so on. And what I love about your message in particular is you're saying, yes, all of that's important. But at the end of the day, what matters is, are we able to talk to each other? Are we able to disagree, but still communicate with love? So your work is about bridging divides versus adhering to a certain set of rules. So can you say more about that?
The human spirit is capable of anything. And so there are so many situations that we may feel there is absolutely no way that I can show up with love in this situation. I feel that in my own life, in multiple locations. And that may be what manifests in this lifetime. It may be that actually in this human body, in the span of 100 years that I have here, I actually am not able to manifest love in this situation, but that the fact that we can't do it or don't choose to do it or whatever it is, doesn't mean that it's not possible. So I remember where this is all kind of wrapping up for me, because when I was in my early 20s, I went and lived with in a monastery with a group of Vietnamese nuns for several months in Thich Nhat Hanh's community in France. And at the time, I was very, very deeply on my spiritual path. I was a meditator. That was my path. I was very, very kind of disciplined and aesthetic, and it was silent meditation. That was it. And I was in that monastery, and at the end, when I kind of chose to, well, I was always coming back into regular life, I had these questions in my mind of like, well, if these nuns are here living in this incredible, peaceful, holistic way, isn't that what we should all be doing? Like that's what humanity is meant to be. We should all be living in a monastic way. And then I had the clarity of like, no, these nuns here, they hold the pole of peace. They show us what is possible at the pole of peace. And that is like a magnet, it's a guiding star that always reminds us that that is possible. In the same way that there are people, energy, situations that are holding the pole of hate, they're showing what is possible in this human form. And so all of these things are deeply, deeply embedded in my soul, in my heart, and in the knowing that any situation where we're approaching it with hate or division or fear, it is possible that that could be held in love. That's possible. And if that's possible, then at least some of us are here to do the work to move us from this pole to this pole.
I love that.
Yeah, I'm one of those people who was called up to do that.
What you're saying reminds me of Thomas Merton, a quote from Thomas Merton. I'm going to butcher this quote, but essentially it's like the monks are like trees that put oxygen in the air, and that is needed for the same reasons that I think you're saying. Like someone needs to hold the ground of peace and love always, so that others can look to that to get through these dark nights of the soul for our world. So it's a beautiful idea. Yeah. Okay. So I want to go back to 2020, 2 weeks before George Floyd was murdered. And you wrote a post called "Performative Allyship is Deadly. Here's what to do instead." And in it, you are saying the hard things. You're challenging white readers, for example. You're saying, quote, "You're here now, but where are you the other 364 days a year when anti-racism isn't trending?" But it's also clear from that piece that you are genuinely trying to be helpful. And I want to read an excerpt of your piece for those who may be unfamiliar with it. So in this piece, "Performative Allyship is Deadly. Here's what to do instead." You wrote, "The problem with performative allyship is not that it's in itself damages, but that it excuses. It excuses privileged people from making the personal sacrifices necessary to touch the depths of the systemic issues it claims to address. If you hashtagged say his name, you stand against racism, right? You've done your bit, right? Wrong. Looking through the stories of apparent white allies shouting for justice, my heart broke to see their hashtag Justice for Ahmaud post, speaking of Ahmaud Arbery, who had just been shot and killed while jogging through a white neighborhood. Those aren't your words, those are mine. I'm just explaining. Seeing the post Justice for Ahmaud immediately followed by a post advertising their latest offering or talking cheerily about something completely unrelated. This kind of allyship is clearly transient. It's a passing story. It's a repost. It's for the gram. It's cheap and inauthentic. Now, this piece, this post really put you on the map as a voice for the Black community during the ascension of Black Lives Matter. And I'm curious as to why you wrote that piece at the time, because from what I can tell, you wrote it 2 weeks before George Floyd was murdered. And how do you feel about where things stand now in terms of performative allyship 4 years later?
I feel so emotional actually thinking about this. Without sounding too lofty, like that piece was channeled. Like I did not have a blog before. I had a Medium page. I had like 4 followers on my Medium page, and I think 2 of them were my parents. I worked in organizational culture, so I'd done diversity and equity stuff, but this was not my work. Like I was not an activist. I was not in racial justice work. Like that, I had never thought these thoughts before. And I remember Jack, my husband, like we were living in our old house, and I guess my son must have been 6 months old, and apparently I just went up to our little office, and I just sat there till like 1 a.m, and I just wrote this in one go and published it. And to my 4 Medium followers, and I think I had maybe like 800 Instagram followers or something like this, all people that I vaguely knew. And then I just left it. It was like, it was not things I was thinking. It was not things I'd ever written before. I just wrote it and then I left it. And then, of course, it took on this kind of life of its own. And we were waking up in the morning, we're like, oh, it's had 1,000 reads. It's had 10,000, 100,000, 1 million, 2 million reads. And it was just totally bizarre. But for whatever reason, this message chose to come through me. And I have some idea of why it would have chosen to come through me to, as you say, put me on the map and get out there and do this work. Because the funny thing is, I would never write that now. Like, I would never write that, what I wrote there, because yes, there's love in it, that you can feel my heart, I guess, because it did magnetize people. But there's also a ton of anger and division and blame. And like, it was deeply personal. Like, part of that essay was, or the post was, yes, putting out an arm to be helpful, but part of it was like my inner child of being a mixed race, dark-skinned girl growing up in a totally white community and just being like angry. And then in that moment, all of my anger was kind of justified in some way, I can say, having never said these things before. And like, that part of me that was like, I am just angry with white people. I'm just angry with whiteness. Like, that was me. That was personal. And so I guess in some way it hit on that central point of truth, which is that those feelings are existing within the Black community. Like, that moment was a purge of rage that had been suppressed for hundreds of years, let me say, or another moment of a purge. And there was the other side, which was my heart, which didn't just get sunk, it didn't get pulled into the pit of anger, but was trying to move beyond. So in some ways it hit on that middle space that I guess people were desperately seeking from, but that certainly wasn't my intention. It just came out.
That's so interesting that you say you wouldn't write that piece again today. Can you say more about that? Like, why that is?
I was pissed off. Like, I was pissed off. And so when I say, like, it's, if you hashtag say his name, you stand against racism, you've done your bit, right, wrong. Like, I felt that. I was like annoyed. I was like, what are you doing? And you don't care. And I needed to process that part of me that felt, you don't care. But I don't feel that anymore, because I did process that part of me, and I, which was, as I say, deeply personal. And in many ways, where I think our collective activism is stuck, is in that wounded child.
This is what I love about you. This is why this conversation is so good, because you are capable of saying, I'm angry about this injustice, but I'm going to honor my core belief in a higher truth of love. And you're always, if you read your blog, you're always trying to get there. In your most recent blog post, you were talking about a colleague dinner that you had with some folks from work, and someone said something that was racist, although inadvertently so. And in your post, you're really honest about the initial shock, the initial anger. And then we see you in the post work through that to get to a place of forgiveness. And that, to me, is the real work that's going to get us through to healing. And that's why I love what you do so much in relation to civil discourse. So thank you for that. I do have a question in relation to that performative allyship post, because what happened in the process of putting you on the map is that you kind of blew up. You got this following, thousands of followers, and then you, I assume, because they came to you in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, And now you're trying to teach principles of love. So you got some criticism in the face of that. So this readership came to you thinking that you were going to have more posts like that one. And then your posts are more like, okay, let's find a compassionate, loving way through for all. You said you got some criticism for that, that was really hard for you. Can you talk about that more?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, to contextualize it, I went from like 1,000 to 50,000 followers in like 2 weeks. And then since then, I've lost 20,000 followers. So it kind of like, that was the journey. And I mean, I even get it as of today. I put a story yesterday about how I'm writing this third essay about civil discourse in this series. And I got a message from a woman who sent me kind of hateful messages before about not taking a stand on things in the way that she thinks I should, just saying, ew. And so like I still get that, and it still hurts me. I don't know if my skin has got thick enough yet or if it ever will, because it hurts on all the levels, personal but also on collective. I feel that grief of like, I cannot believe that this is the way that we treat each other. People who are there, all of us who are out there trying our best. And I got a lot of criticism from all angles. I got criticism from within the Black community for being like an impediment to the work that more I was about to say more radical. I think my work is deeply radical, but let's say more radical in the sense of like a particular structure within critical race theory, Black Lives Matter movement for being like for standing in between that and making it harder for them to do their work. Because if I'm over here saying, hey, can't we approach this with love and compassion, but I'm somehow excusing people from doing the very real work to meet justice. Whereas I'm here saying this is the work for justice. So it's a difference in perspective. I got criticized by liberal white people for the same thing. I got criticized by people on the right wing for being a communist. I mean, it was just, I got an email from someone telling me I was a Marxist piece of filth. The same day I got an email from someone telling me I was part of the alt-right. So it was like, it was such an incredible and painful, but but giraffe view, an incredible microcosmic experience of how angry the idea of approaching things with love and compassion makes people, how unsettling it is, because people can't conceptualize how and why that might be in working in the same direction of the thing that they deeply want but can't seem to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
We have been using these well-worn tools of activism steeped in blame and shame and hatred and division, and we are in exactly the same place. Our problems just are wearing different outfits.
I have nowhere near the experience in that kind of vitriol that you have, and my heart really breaks hearing it. Like, it's hard to hear. I almost feel myself kind of getting emotional to hear it, because you are like, the world really needs what it is that you're saying. Because what's happening is, I just feel like we really missed a moment in 2020, in post 2020, where it is so hard to get the country and the world to wake up and collectively address anything. And yet what happened in the wake of the murder of George Floyd is like everybody was like, oh shit. Like, this is serious. And you had companies, big corporate organizations, owning up to their own systemic racism and saying, we vow to do better. That kind of accountability at a corporate level, government level, personal, individual level was a real moment for us. And then what happened is there's this backlash. There's the backlash from the white backlash from the right, where They're criticizing critical race theory. They're trying to do away with the 1619 Project, trying to ban books from libraries and whatnot. But then there's also a lot of anger that came from the left, where genuinely, and I have some experience with this, where genuinely well-intentioned people step forward and try and help, and then say the wrong thing or step in the landmine, and then feel the effects of that. And then it becomes easier to just not say anything. And so then we back away from the conversation. And you've written about this in some of your posts, where companies aren't talking about politics. Families don't want to talk about politics. And then what happens is, in the absence of those conversations, we don't learn how to have those conversations. And so all we can do is just throw tomatoes at each other. And that's what makes your work so incredibly important. It's just unfortunate that you have to have the mental strength to walk forward in the world, receiving the criticism that you do for it.
Yeah. And I think I've really been thinking about this recently, like it's somehow something like at the heart of this is this collective distorted mind, this collective belief that difference cannot coexist. That's really actually, when I think about it, it's at the bottom of everything. It's like, you know, if we think about all the isms, racism, sexism, homophobia, it's like difference is bad and wrong. We have to deal with it in these ways, with dominance, with extermination, with whatever it is. And then in our response to it, it's also like difference can't coexist. Like your perspective, your experiences, your views cannot coexist with mine. And so you either need to change to think what I think, or you also need to be dominated or done away with. And it's like we see it in like every way that we deal with disagreement, whether it be authoritarian ways of dealing with disagreement, which exist, as you say, on the left and the right, whether it be this kind of like very, very ineffective, but it's like seemingly loving, active consensus way of like, you know, let's just get everyone to be on the same page and everyone to agree, and kind of that kind of like kumbaya thing, which I instinctively love, but you know, from being in those circles as well, like that also is in some way saying difference can't coexist, even to the way that our democracy is set up, which certainly in the UK, it's all about a battle for dominance. Like I need to persuade and debate and negotiate so that everybody believes what I believe and thinks that what you believe is wrong. And even though it looks more smart and it looks more formal in the halls of politics, it's the same thing. And the real question of like, how can we actually exist in a world where difference will always be there, difference of opinion will always be there, difference of opinion is necessary in order for us to grow and thrive? That question, I really feel that we haven't collectively inquired upon, because our focus has been so much on in this fear state of that where there is difference of perspective, of ideology, one group will inherently be unsafe.
That's one of the other things that I really appreciate about your writing. In one of your posts, you said, we cannot heal a racist society with the same mind that created it. You said that if we try and fix a problem with the same mind that created it, meaning if we try and shame and blame and police behavior and eradicate people, then all we do is just end up recreating the same problem. And I'm curious as to, and you shared a little bit about this with your spiritual background, but how did you come to that view? And how do you see it at play in your work now?
Suffering, it takes on so many guises, you know, and our public commentary would like for us to believe that this is the suffering that really matters right now. this person's suffering, this group's suffering, this type of suffering, this really matters. But I have always felt, and even I have to gain some courage to say this here, that the suffering of a group of people, like the suffering of a Black ancestor of mine who was a slave, is no more or less important than the suffering of a child who is abused by their parent, which is no more or less important but than the mentally ill person who is not supported to be in society. And I had that experience with my sister, very close to home. She had a very severe mental illness, and so I've always known, like, I've always been confused almost by, like, why is this suffering seen as more or less important than this suffering? Like, it's all suffering. And so when I trace the, like, origin of that suffering in any single manifestation that it looks like, there is always like a deeply human internal energetic, like it's fear or it's greed or it's the belief below that we're separate from one another. And so for me, it's almost been like, it's almost more difficult for me to think in the other way, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I have to take a lot of conceptual leaps in my mind to get to the point of thinking, like, well, this group suffering matters more than this group suffering, and therefore these people are bad and wrong. I have to really try and force myself to get there, because in my mind, I'm just like, everybody is a victim here. Like, the murderer and the murdered is a victim. And of course, if it was my child, I would not be able to get there, obviously.
Yeah.
There are places where I cannot get there because I'm not an ascended saint. I don't have that. But when I feel into the wider world, I really have to try to get into the mindset of, like, because this person has done this, they are bad and wrong. Because this group of people have done this, they are bad and wrong. Because it is so clear to me that anyone who is hurting and anyone who hurts is the same.
That is so huge, Holiday. Thank you for sharing that, because this idea that suffering is suffering, regardless of which group is suffering, is incredibly important. And I think that is what we're tempted to do. We have a connection with a certain group, and so we want to elevate that suffering. And we can prioritize that at the expense of other suffering. But I think a healthy approach is just to do what you're doing, which is to say suffering is suffering, and let's seek to eradicate it at its root, no matter who is suffering. And you also said something else that I thought was interesting, where it's the murderer and the murdered are both suffering. And that gets you into a whole can of worms. I'll just share from my experience in the course. The central practice of the course is forgiveness. And so we are seeking to forgive no matter what. And that means forgiving the oppressor as well as the oppressed, with the understanding that everyone is suffering. And that was actually a core tenet of the civil rights movement, which is you see the oppressor as a victim too. Now, when you share that message, love the oppressor as well as the oppressed, you get a lot of pushback in relation to it. And I heard from there's a woman named Nina Barnes who I was listening to not too long ago, and I asked her this question, one that I know will be close to your heart, which is, how do you share the message of loving the oppressor and not get criticized for it? And she was basically like, no matter what, you're going to get criticized for that message. However, if you don't love the oppressor, you are in the place of us and them, which is what caused this problem to begin with. And so the only way through is to love everybody in the recognition that everyone is suffering.
I think about this from many angles, like in my personal life, to forgive I actually really struggle in my personal life. We have this joke in my family about in my dad's family about Guyanese vengeance. So we're Guyanese, like, yes, there's the Guyanese vengeance, like we it's a family thing. And so it's something I really struggle with, actually, to forgive in my personal life someone that has hurt me, which is it's my practice. And um and when I think about the collective, like to come out broader than me and into the collective, and to see oppressor and oppressed as the same, that's actually very, very easy for me. And so, as an aside, I always think that there is the responsibility for those of us who aren't personally impacted by a particular thing to hold that pole of peace and love, because we can. And we not, maybe not that we shouldn't, but perhaps it is that we shouldn't expect people who are in it to be able to do it. Like, for example, in 2020, I could not hold that place of love and peace. I was so in it. I was so in my own pain and trauma, and I had to work through it and grapple through it. And I'm so glad that there were people out there who were able to really hold it, because they were able to hold the pole for me to find my way home. But in terms of like why it's important, I mean, sometimes I think it's like we're so addicted to our righteousness in some ways, that the idea of jumping to a level of consciousness where this just is the truth, where oppressor and oppressed are equal, feels so painful for us, because we feel like we're letting go of justice and righteousness, and they're going to get away from it. And I think of it as like, it's like we're holding on to this like poisonous, like decaying organ, and like we're just so desperate to hold on to it. And then we look down and we're like, why do I want to hold on to this? But we haven't done that yet. We're still like clutching it so tightly, we can't even look at it to say, like, this is dying, let it go. And then jump, because it takes a leap of faith, because we don't know. Like, you have those of us who are saying, like, love no matter what, trust, because we're hearing that from somewhere. Love no matter what, trust. But even I have that seed of doubt in myself, because I haven't made that full jump, because we haven't made that full jump. We need to make it together. We need to live it together. So it requires an inordinate amount of faith. And I think in this moment, it's like, what do we have left? Because all of our other strategies of creating structures and using dominance and creating the blame and shame and like I say, like, we're moving around the chess pieces, but we're still seeing abject suffering in all of these different ways. So at the end of the road, maybe all we have left is faith. And enough wisdom traditions have said this, enough of us have heard this in our hearts to know that something is calling on us to take that leap of faith. And I think that that's very, very difficult for most of us.
I love that phrase, addicted to our righteousness, because I think that that's where we are. We are so afraid to let go of that rotting organ, even though it's not only rotting in our hands, it's killing us in the process, but we still won't let it go. When you preach a message of unconditional forgiveness, as you're saying, the pushback is you are just letting abusers get away with their abusing ways. You are letting the bad guys get away with it. And I love the Martin Luther King's message, where he said that love is the redemptive force in the universe. So if you want to continue to create division, go ahead and hate, shame, blame, and cancel people. That's fine. That will just recreate all that we already are facing. But if you want to actually heal someone's heart and to get them to change their behavior, then you have to love them through. And that's why this is the radical work, because it's the hard work. It's the easy work to shame and blame and stand in your righteousness. It's the hard work to say, you know what, you're going to attack me and I'm going to love you anyway. And that's why you saying forgiveness is your spiritual practice. It's mine as well. I think true forgiveness is a total shaft of light from heaven on this earth. I think it's the highest form of love that we can attain here, because it's so easy to love people when they're doing what you want them to do. It's really hard to love them in the face of an attack. And so if we can touch that, it's like what you're saying, there's these two levels. There's where we are, and then there's the forgiveness that we can't touch. But somebody has to hold that pole. Somebody has to hold the pole, as you're saying, of forgiveness, so that we can all find our way home. And what I appreciate about, I know I keep saying what I appreciate about your work, but it's true. I appreciate a lot about your work, is that even though you just said, I'm not perfect, I'm not a saint, I'm struggling to forgive, that's fine, because you model it for everyone. Where what I love about you is that you're always trying to find your way to that higher place, always. And if you fall, because you're human, you're honest about it. But I trust that you're always going to get up and try and get back there. And that was evident in a conversation that you had a few years ago with Esther Perel. Can we talk about that a bit?
So I had published an infographic about the difference between debate and dialogue, which again, I was like, was a type of stuff that I'd been doing in my organizational work for years. So I did the infographic and I put it on Instagram. And this was kind of, in the wake of George Floyd murder. It was when all conversations about race were very, very hot. And there was the big kind of trend of like, essentially like hunting out white people, to public figures, to cancel for various reasons, including appropriating Black women's work. And I was also still very much in I don't even think I was in righteous anger. I was in wounded anger at the time. I've never really been so much a righteous anger person. I'm more a wounded anger person. So I was still in that place. And the next morning, I woke up to like 20, 30 Instagram messages from people all saying, oh, Esther Perel has posted like exactly the same Instagram infographic. Like this is an example of white women appropriating Black women's work. And so the first message I remember I received, the first thing I thought was like, oh my gosh, that's so great. Me and Esther Perel saying the same thing, like, yay, fangirling. And then as I started to get more messages, it was like I got on the train because it felt good actually to have that righteous anger, because that righteous anger was feeding like the pain cycle that was in me. Because a lot of what I was working through at that time was like, I'm in pain, and this is the reason for this is what I was going through. All of the pain in my life is because we live in a racist world. It was a very convenient way of explaining away any pain that I'd ever had. And of course, some of that was true. A lot of that was true, but it was also a way to put everything into that bucket, which is why all of this collective stuff is deeply personal. Anyway, so I then sent an email to her kind of PR team, like a pretty agitating email. Say, I think the subject title was like Esther Perel appropriating Black women's work. And I said, look, I've had these 30 messages that it was just a really shitty email, basically. Like, I'd love to believe that it's not the case, but based on history, da da da. So I sent that email and I immediately got a response back, because of course they're terrified of getting the mob after them. And then a kind of like deferent response, which I think would be different now, because I think people are much more kind of like, no, I'm not going to play into that. But at the time, people were terrified. And then in the end, I kind of ended up getting on a call with her. And by that point, I'd kind of started to pick through my own stuff and realize what had got me there. And I just, we just spoke honestly. And I said to her, this is what I'm going through. I'm dealing with this like decades of pain from experiencing very real racism, and in my personal life and in my ancestral memory. And in that moment, you were the convenient target for that. And then she was like, let's talk this through, let's do this live, because we worked through like what was happening, and then her fear and her defensiveness and her anger as well. And like we basically like in this one relationship experience what we might say both sides were experiencing at the time, but were able to get to a place where we both took in some way responsibility for our process and were able to have a really beautiful dialogue, which by many people was seen as that, like a really beautiful and honest dialogue. And then by some people was just absolutely slammed because me turning up, showing up there and saying like, hey, I was actually kind of the bad actor in this situation. And yes, she felt defensive and like not angry and angry and protective of her reputation, but actually it was me who went in there like using the time to project my anger and so using the kind of fear that was there at the time to do whatever it was I was trying to do. And that really, really was tough for people to hear because the idea of a Black person at that time, doing anything less than morally perfect was like incomprehensible and damaging to the movement.
As we said, you acquired a significant following, being a voice for injustice. And then to be in this interview where you're like, yeah, that email had some heat. And I was owning the power that I had in that moment. And I went from victim to perpetrator. And you were so honest. You even said, it wasn't just that I was after justice, I was after vengeance too. And that was an incredibly honest thing to admit, to say, yeah, I was hurt and I came after you. And I'm, as you say, the bad actor here. I'm the one who's in the wrong. And I can't imagine the strength that it took to do that. And so what was the reaction from your community when that interview aired?
I mean, it was mixed. Most people, I think, had the experience that you spoke about, but I got messages saying like, this is a minstrel show. Hate, like you're an Uncle Tom, you're bringing the movement back however many years. And the thing is, it was like, and this is messages from white people as well. That for me was the thing that really boggled my mind, that I was getting messages from white people criticizing me because it was withholding their movement in some way. I mean, the whole thing just became so topsy-turvy and a real example of where people believe that hate and judgment and shame are the tools to get to love and equality, and how lost we have got. But I think the thing there about the vengeance piece, which really served me well, is like I had and I have an enormous amount of compassion for the part of me that does want vengeance, because I'm like, of course I do. It was hard to grow up as like the only dark-skinned person amongst tons of white people. I experienced loads of like really painful racism from teachers and mainly adults, actually, never kids, friends, parents, strangers. I mean, of course, I wanted vengeance, and I don't feel bad for that. And also, I get to move through that to the higher thing. And I think that that's the thing that breaks it, because a lot of the time people either like, they won't admit, this is across all things, that they have hate or revenge or like any pain-based expression in their heart. They can't see that in themselves. Whereas I didn't, or maybe I did that at the beginning, but I was able to get to a place of like of deep compassion for myself. And it is because of that ability to hold myself in deep compassion where I look at that and I think, of course I felt that. Like it's been hard. That makes it possible to hold that for others. And so whilst it was hard as a situation, in many ways it really showed me the anchors that I have to be able to do what I did with relative ease. That was not one of the hardest things I've had to do, because I do not see myself as a bad person in the same way that I do not see another person who desires vengeance or revenge for their very real pain as a bad person.
In that vulnerability, you make it possible to have a real conversation. That whole situation could have had a whole different narrative. It could have been Esther appropriated your work, even though she said she's been using that graphic since the 90s. So I'm sure you believe her that she didn't.
Yeah.
But it could have been a situation where the narrative is she did, and you confronted her, and then she got defensive, and then she's another example of white fragility, and then the conversation just goes off in that direction, and you get to hold on to that toxic righteousness, and her reputation is damaged. And that's why I think we've missed the moment and backed away from these conversations. What I loved about what you did was you modeled a way through where you were like, that the way I came at this wasn't right. And I'm going to own that. And she owned her things too. She was like, I was defensive and I was angry. And she even said, I was on the hunt there for a minute. And I think that only in an act of higher hand at work, I love in the interview, Esther said that she got that email from you that was heated, and she went out with someone that night who knew you.
Mm.
And the person who knew you said, I know Holiday, she's not out for blood. She's capable of reason. You can reach her. She has good intentions. She has a loving heart. And then that softened Esther, and then you were able to actually meet somewhere. So I just thought the whole thing was a good, it was beautiful modeling of the civil discourse that you teach. Okay, 2 questions, and then we'll close.
Okay.
So this is a podcast called Exploring A Course in Miracles. And I know you're not a course student, but you did say forgiveness is the core of your spiritual practice. Forgiveness is the core teaching of the course. And you have some experience with it. So I'm just curious as if you could share a bit about your experience with A Course in Miracles.
Yeah, the course kind of came to me maybe 10 years ago. I had a boyfriend who was very into Christian mysticism, an Irish boyfriend, and he was exploring his roots, and he wasn't drawn to the church, and then started following, Thomas Merton was one of his big people, and there was another Trappist monk, I can't remember, and he kind of brought the course into my life. And I read the course and I did the lessons probably for about a year, and I was in a course study group, and it was beautiful. And I don't think I was ever able to hear the course or had the environment and the community to bring the course from conceptual to real. And so when I watched, for example, your video on Martin Luther King that we were talking about, and though that grounding didn't reach me, but now we've had this conversation and we've been speaking about it, I'm like, yeah, wow, I want to dive back in and because of course the course is deeply practical. Maybe where I was at the time, I couldn't hear that.
I mean, the heart of the course is that you're looking through the behaviors and the personality and what's unreal in someone to the heart of what's real about them. And that's the basis on which you forgive and love and heal. And so that message, that's the center of what the course is about. And if you take that message and you apply it to something like injustice, okay, now social activism becomes about seeing each other as we truly are. And then it gets to that higher place. If you're holding the pole, as you say, yes, for what is ultimately real and true in all of us. And that's a whole different conversation.
Yes. And the thing that just came to me there is like the willingness to do that, even when the other person isn't going to do it for you. I think because even as you're saying it, I can hear all the voices, mine and others come in, but like, no, but how can we look through all the identities and then when all of our structures have been built around, and it's like, that is the pole, like I will do it, even if I'm the only person in the world doing it. And of course, none of us ever are, we aren't. but to do it especially if you won't do it for me. You can't do
Well,
it.
that's a beautiful way to end. Really, honestly, thank you. Is there anything else that you want to say before we close?
Yeah, I think I really, really appreciate this reflection that you've given to me about this piece of like that I'm always trying to find the highest way, because I that really resonates with me and feels so true. And I think that real seeker to really be a seeker, which is what I am and have always been, is is a great thing to have reflected back, because it's so important to me to transmit that I most definitely do not have things figured out. Some things I think relatively figured out, but not everything. And I was listening to your MLK video, and when you said about but it is on, like, some, I'm paraphrasing again, but it is incumbent on us to choose to do the hard thing and love no matter what, essentially. And I feel that is where I am at now. It's like, yes, to don't have it all figured out, are human, all of this, but also not to get lost in that, because there is also an uprightness to being able to say, and I'm going to choose to do the hard thing. And I just wanted to share that, because I think that's the like part of the curve that I'm really on, and it feels very beautiful and very needed to always be exploring, but also to know what we know, to know what we know and to go forth and do it.
Thank you for that. One of the reasons why I was drawn to your work as well is in a space where everyone's just kind of tinkering with specific actions. Do this, don't do that. What you're saying is like the hard work is loving anyway. So let's just get there. Like, let's hold that space, be that person who can love anyway, and trust that all the tinkering that needs to be done will come from that. Just going back to the safe space discussion, you're not going to create a safe space ultimately if in your mind as a leader you're thinking, okay, I can't say this, I shouldn't do this, should acknowledge this, blah blah blah. What comes from that safe space is a leader who has the mindset of, I am truly going to love anyway.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of, it'll all stem from right-mindedness is so core in what you're doing. And please don't let the criticism that people feel so free to offer online hold you back from all that you're here to do and give on this level. The world needs your voice and needs you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, I guess that's it. Yeah, I do feel myself getting emotional. I'm I'm supremely frustrated with wanting to stand up for what is good and loving, and then you feel the backlash, and so you shut up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a lot of people who I think would be the righteous, the aggressive righteousness is what's loud and what's working, but it's its own form of oppression.
I mean, the only thing I'll say on that is, like, that's why we need to talk to each other. That's why community is so important. Because even coming out this conversation, I'm like, yeah, I'm bolstered. My heart is bolstered to go and, to actually not be alone. Sometimes we feel we're alone, but to actually know, really on a practical level, we are not alone. And we need it, all of us.
It's hard to be a solopreneur too, where you're just like writing and it's like, is anybody reading this? And
And then also, this is the thing, to not get sucked into the battle of like the righteous battle of being like, and now I'm here on my white horse fighting for love. And just like, it's almost like to hold that, it's almost like because I think about like the being like mother and embodying that kind of destiny, but I feel like it's almost like I don't know because I'm not grandmother, but it's almost like grandmother energy. It's like I am just going to hold this space of love and do it in my life and in my sphere of influence and in my work or whatever it is, without getting involved in your business. There's like a real like humble, solid wisdom, because as soon as I feel it in myself, I get sucked into then fighting. I'm back there again. So there's a
Yeah.
real, it's faith, isn't it? It's faith that like if enough of us just do without making the others wrong and bad,
Mm-hmm.
it will be.
I love what you just said about grandmother energy. I was watching these interviews with Maya Angelou, and I was like, God, I do a lot in my work of apologizing. So it's like, yes, we're going to forgive unconditionally, but that doesn't mean we don't hold people accountable for their behavior. And it doesn't mean that we don't take people out of society when they deserve to be in prison, but the prison system really needs to be reconfigured so that it's not punitive, it's rehabilitative. And I'm always like in this energy of like, but, because what happens is when you give someone the directive of we forgive no matter what, then they're always going to say, you don't know my story. And then they insert some story, horrible, horrific story, and says, okay, your spiritual version of forgiveness is good up to that point.
Yes.
And then it's no good.
Yeah, totally.
And so I find I do a lot of bending and apologizing and saying, but we're still going to hold people accountable. What I loved about the Maya Angelou interviews is she's just like, this is how it is. And I need more of that in my own teaching, like holding the pole. As I love that. I'm going to use that phrase, holding the pole.
Me too. Me and you and me both, sister.
All right. I know you've got to go, but thank you for this. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I hope we can talk again soon.
You too. Let's stay in touch. I would love that.
Okay. All right. Bye.